this is what we'll talk through this a little bit. This is kind of my facilitation training, right? And to contextualize this a little bit, when I was trained to facilitate 12 years ago, right, I was trained to be a minimalist facilitator, to do kind of, we kind of call it the referee model, right? I keep time, and if someone breaks a rule, I blow a whistle, right? But other than that, it's not about me, right? You just kind of, and I think the thought behind that was, if you have good ground rules and a good environment and good material, and you know, and people in a circle, then it will just kind of run itself, right? And that's kind of how we started the first couple of years. But then I recognized that the conversations we were having were not deep, right? Yes, we were in a circle, but people didn't really explore tensions. People didn't react to each other, right? People showed up because they were fired up about the topic, but it was still an individual collection of opinion, right? We didn't really have. So then it slowly and surely, after, over the last 9 years, I've been training facilitators to be more and more active, because like, we're not doing the kind of things that feel we need to do. We're not working through the growth zone, right? We're having this easy conversation, right? Or maybe people will say, yeah, we need a balance between those two things, but then it was almost an easy balance, right? Say, recognizing, okay, we're not at the extremes, we're in the middle, but it's just like this comfortable big middle, right? Instead of saying, okay, we're on that balance. Like that one question I asked, hey, you're saying there's an imbalance. Are we too far? You know, we're trying to we got to negotiate what that line is versus just saying it's a balance, right? So we weren't doing the hard work, so I became more and more kind of focused on training that. The other thing, this list of 10 things, so you got the first 5 on this page, the next 10. I think about 7 of them were on the original workbook that someone else gave me, right? I'm like, this is what a facilitator does. And we used to train this, we had to start with this facilitation training. But then the more and more we taught, we realized that these are 10 responsibilities for a facilitator, particularly a deliberative facilitator. I make a distinction between a facilitator trying to spark these kind of public conversations and a facilitator you hire for an organization. By definition, an organizational facilitator is hired by that organization to help them make a decision. They're in the service of that group, right? Whereas me, like if I'm running this in the public, yes, in some ways I'm serving this group, I want you to have a better conversation, things like that, but more I'm serving my community, right? I'm kind of using you to have a deep conversation about a broader issue. So I've kind of got split loyalties, right? That I'm not just wanting you to have an interesting conversation or have fun, you know, I'm wanting to kind of push you to really think deeper about this issue, right? So that's where the theory that I've been developing lately is this deliberative facilitator is a little bit different than a typical facilitator. To facilitate means to make easy, right? So normally I get hired by a company, that company says, we want to make you do this, and then I design a process to get you to that, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the deliberative facilitator is different. My job is to make democracy work better. So that's where these come up with. So then we realized as I started teaching these 10 kind of responsibilities that it's easy to teach the responsibilities one at a time. You have to do all these 10 things, but then we recognize there's tension between these responsibilities. Right? And particularly if you look at responsibility 1, remains impartial, remaining impartial is pretty easy if that's what you're focused on, right? If I don't say anything, I'm impartial, right? But anytime I do anything to fulfill the other 9 responsibilities, I'm probably violating impartiality, right? Or the same thing, the second responsibility allows the participants to own the process and topic as much as possible, right? Anytime I'm doing anything else, I'm probably violating that, right? Because that approach, what I need to be doing is I want you to talk about what's important to you, right? I want you to kind of drive the conversation in a sense, right? But we found when we let people drive the conversation, they have this really easy surface conversation, right? So a lot of the other later responsibilities violate that, right? So then the theory of teaching facilitation, deliberative facilitation is really, the art is balancing all these things, right? That you have all these things that you need to be doing, but there's not a right answer, the right one to do, right? So it's become very much, there's a whole literature on the kind of the self-reflective practitioner, right? And it's this notion that facilitation is very much an art, not a science. I can't teach it on, this is how you should facilitate. It's like, these are the principles of facilitation, and you're constantly kind of balancing. And it depends, A, on the purpose of the event, right? If the event's much more exploration, right, let's learn how people talk about this issue, then y'all are driving primarily. I don't need to do something, right? If the purpose is we've been studying this for a couple of years, and there's this clear, 2 or 3 tensions we really work through, I'm going to be very focused. I'm going to tell you what to talk about because I really wanted information on this, right? So the purpose of the event dictates it, the group dictates it, right? If you have a really good group that's facilitating or deliberating on their own, I don't need to do much, right? But if you have a group that's all thinking the same way, I've got to do a lot. I've got to play devil's advocate, right? If I have a group that's really young, I tell you. So by the purpose and the group kind of really dictates how you balance these things, right? As we go through. So This is new. I mean, literally, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 days, I'll finish this article and send it in. So if you're interested, I can send it to you when I'm done. I'll be working on it tonight in my hotel room. So I'll walk through these a little bit, and then I'll try to give examples of kind of what I did during the event to try to do these, right? So, remains impartial about the subject of the forum. The biggest thing here is you never heard my opinion, right? I let one little thing slip when I kind of made the cry. I forgot, one of the two of y'all were talking, and I said, yeah, Americans aren't very good at that, right? That was one probably not appropriate, right? But generally, and I've done this topic a lot. I have lots of ideas, right? But I never told a story. I never said what I thought was important, those type of things. That's the main thing about impartiality I have to train with students, which is hard. I get really good students to apply for my program, right? And then I tell them, your opinion doesn't matter during the forum, right? Now, I've been smart. It took me 8 years, but I finally figured out, because what I do with the notes, they used to just kind of turn in all the notes to me, and I'd have to make sense of them, right? Then I started getting them to type up the notes and send them to me, so it's a lot easier for me to kind of negotiate. Now what I do is I set up a Google Docs form, like a Survey Monkey essentially, that has questions in there, right? What advantages do people like about approach 1? What disadvantages? So then they have to self-organize their notes into those boxes for me. So when I get all the notes, I have, they're already kind of pre-organized. But then now when I do that, I also ask, so what's your opinion about approach 1, right? They can't express it during the forum, right? But now that they've led this conversation and they're smart and they know about tensions and so forth, so I'm able to kind of let them give their opinion, right? Which helps me as I'm understanding the issue and kind of thinking about moving forward. But during the event itself, their opinion is relevant. Right? Now, they can fudge that somewhat because they can always play a devil's advocate. They can ask a question that directs, if they think personally people are not talking about equality, they can ask a question about equality to bring it up, but they should do that for the sake of the conversation, not do that to get people to think like they want them to think, right? So impartiality is I've already talked a lot about passion partiality, that we're balancing that. The second one again is, in some senses, I want people to control the conversation. One way I did that was, my first question was always, what do y'all think about this? Right? Obviously, the framework was already structuring some things, so I'm asking you to respond to this, right? But I didn't, the first question wasn't. So one of the ideas here is to, require internships. What do y'all think about internships? Okay. I didn't start with a specific question. I want to start with a very broad question. Later on, I might have some specific questions that come in, right? But I'm trying to direct it. Most of my interventions were getting people to respond to each other and that kind of stuff. I made very few interventions, which I'll call in a second transition questions, where I defined the topic, that I wanted you to respond to something that I thought, right? And part of that was because you're a really good group that knew about this, So with this group, I didn't have to transition much. Often you have to transition a little bit more because the groups don't speak differently. Third, keeps track of the deliberation in terms of time and subject matter. So this is a basic facilitation, they're the timekeeper. So you heard us few interventions. We got a couple minutes left here and that kind of stuff that I kind of told you where we were. When I'm doing my projects, we go from small group to large group a lot. So we have the students at the table, but then they'll go up to me at the front to do a keypad thing or have a presentation and go back. So my students have to kind of keep time and chart. Just like the notes are your friend, time is your friend, or time limits are your friend in terms of cutting people off. I didn't know we had to cut anybody off here. None of y'all were long-winded, right? Which is actually amazing, because often when I'm training professors, we tend to be long-winded, right? So you can often say, we need to move on in about 3 minutes, so can you get to, what do you want me to write down, that kind of stuff. So you kind of I tell my students, blame me. If you need to cut someone off because of time, say, Dr. Parkinson's going to move on in a minute, so I need to make sure we get to this or whatever, right? But part of your job, keeping on track of time and subject matter, right? This is one of the harder skills of, if someone is telling a story that seems to be a tangent, to what degree do you cut them off? One of the biggest tensions for our work are stories are powerful. Stories are so rich, but stories take a lot of time. So to what degree do you let someone, if you got 15 minutes for an approach, someone tells a 5-minute story, that's a third of your time, right? So in the middle of the story, can you tell as a facilitator whether that story is going to land somewhere important, or this person just likes telling stories, right? So that transition, and normally we wouldn't cut off a story. We never say a story is irrelevant. We might check, we want to make sure, is that, how does this pertain to this approach? And you normally either get, well, I'm getting there, right? Or the person realizes that they're just telling a random story that has nothing to do with this, thinking up on it, keeping it on track, but keeping something on track in terms of subject matter, again, is attention. Like to what degree am I dictating what the appropriate subject matter is or not, right? So those tangents are always interesting cases. And that goes back to the self-reflective practitioner. What I'm able to do with my program is we'll prep for an event in class, and we'll have a specific kind of process design and facilitator guide. I'll kind of show you examples tomorrow if you want. And then we run the event, say on a Thursday night, and the next Tuesday in class we get debrief it. How did it go, right? And in particular, what are situations, right? So then those are always situations. Man, I had this person that started telling this, and then we all talk about it. How can we react to that? Well, what intervention did you do? What could have, and that conversation between lots of facilitators is huge. And that's one of the reasons I think programs like Wendy and I are so valuable, because we're doing more of these public processes that require facilitation, but often the facilitators are just trained beforehand, right? Come show up an hour early, we'll train you to facilitate. But we get to have these students in class and debrief them, and I can require them to keep journals, and I can videotape them and watch them, So by the time students leave our programs, they're pretty accomplished facilitators, right? They've got a lot of experience, but they also have a lot of time for self-reflection, right? And I think we're creating a skill set out there that's so valuable in our community. So fourth, manages the group well and encourages everyone to join the conversation and ensure no one dominates. So again, a basic facilitation skill, make sure everyone talks, right? We actually had everyone talking here. I think you only talked once, right? But you did talk, right? You noticed we had a couple of interventions that I made in the sense of maybe we could hear from someone who hasn't spoken before, right? There's a few times that 2 or 3 people raised their hand at the same time. I normally would pick the person who spoke the least, right? To kind of talk first, kind of in a way, so you're making kind of some choices as we go. But you want to kind of make room. We tend to never call on people. Like, I wouldn't say, you haven't talked yet, what do you think about this, right? I might open up space, so that, maybe you haven't heard from someone to talk about. I certainly kind of scan the room, so if I saw someone who hasn't spoken much, trying to make eye contact or whatever, I would pay particularly attention to them. Someone who's talking a lot, I might not pay so much attention to them, right? Or I might just make eye contact almost to say, you haven't spoken yet, I've noticed that, and that might kind of, so there's like lots of little subtle things that you can do, but we tend not to call on people directly. Or if we call on them directly, we make it easy for them to say no, right? You want to jump in here or not? No, okay, we don't want to pressure anyone, right? The other thing is if someone's dominating or want that and other people can't get in, the basic challenge, and this is probably one of the biggest challenges facilitators say when I ask them, is how do you deal with a dominator? The basic idea here is, instead of trying to get that person to stop talking, get other people to talk. Right? It's a lot easier to get more people to talk versus to get someone to shut up, in a way. And getting someone to stop talking again, use the notes, right? I want to make sure we need to move on, but I want to make sure we get this. So what are you saying, kind of thing, right? Or asking people to react. What do people think about that idea, right? Because hopefully they won't respond to their own idea. Sometimes they do. One facilitator that I really like, Betty Knight, who's been doing this work for 30 years, tells a story where she had a dominator, just every single question would talk. So she's like using all the tricks in the book, so then finally she said, because it was a man, she said, what do you think of mother's perspective here? What would a mother say? Guess what he did? If my mother was here, she would say, all your little strategies sometimes don't necessarily. But you do want it, and that's why we have the ground rule, that to be brief and those type of things. And just the process design of having small groups helps that, right? To have a group of 20, NIF model kind of typically says, 15 to 20 is like, that's such a big group, it's so hard, right? So when we do some groups, we can do as little as 4. We have 4 participants, we're happy, right? But normally we have somewhere between 4 to 8, which seems to be the right number, right? Once you have 10 or 12, it's just so easy to hide in a sense. And it's not, probably the biggest challenge when you have more than 10 or 12, it's I want interaction. I want people to react to each other's idea, but when there's 12, there's so many people that want to talk, right? That you mainly just have an individual collection of opinion because you want everyone to talk, right? Once you have a smaller group, then you can actually have a lot more interaction and go back and forth and and do those type of things. So fifth, models and encourages different attitudes and skills. Primarily, this is about listening, right? Modeling a good listener, modeling a good question. This is a really interesting thing. I do this with groups a lot, with high school kids and things like that. Like, how many classes have you had in your education career that focused on expression, whether written expression or verbal expression, right? Tons, right? Probably 1 or 2 a semester your whole life, right? How many classes have you taken that have focused on listening? Now, communication majors sometimes raise their hand. I took interpersonal communication, there was a chapter on listening, that kind of stuff, right? Or if you've taken conflict classes, there's empathic listening, but very few, right? How many classes have you taken on how to ask good questions? Asking good questions is a huge skill, and we never teach it, right? I mean, maybe one little component of a class somewhere, right? But the notion of how to ask good questions is just critical to inquiry, and critical to community, and critical to democracy. And it's just not a subject we teach, right? So that's a lot of what the facilitator is doing. And I mentioned this earlier, where you really see it in event after an event, that if we do a 3 approaches and IF thing, the first approach, the facilitator is asking all these questions and doing all these things. By the 3rd approach, people are doing it to each other. Right? They're asking each other questions, right? They're doing perspective taking on their own, right? They're asking each other these reaction questions and probing questions we'll talk about in a little bit, right? That's because you're modeling it. The tension there, this is one particular tension that comes up, is the main tenet of a good listener is eye contact, right? And nonverbal cues. That sometimes can violate impartiality, right? You don't want to say, oh, yeah, I agree with that. That's great. That's really good. Because now you're saying, ooh, you like their ideas, right? You have to be very careful. As a facilitator, you want to say, ooh, that's a good idea. Right? You want to say thank you for your contribution, or thanks for, you can thank the behavior, but you don't want to evaluate the ideas. Because if you say, oh, that's a really good idea, then the next person speaks to you. Okay. And you don't say good idea, then you're, some partiality. But the other thing is, if you're speaking and I'm really eye contact listening to you, I'm missing the rest of the room, right? So as a facilitator, I need to know how people react. I need to know while you're talking, if Jerome rolls his eyes, I need to know, okay, he disagrees here. Do I make space for him to talk, or but how do you really kind of model really good listening skills without looking at somebody, right? So sometimes we talk about that beforehand. As a facilitator, I'm going to be kind of looking around the room. So, but the main thing is we want people talking to each other. We don't want it to be participant to the facilitator, participant to the facilitator, participant. So actually, I didn't do a very good job of this, right? That our modeling here when we did the forum was mainly kind of most of y'all talking to me, right? And I think part of that's because we're spread out a little bit. We're not a small table, right? So it was a little bit harder for me to kind of do that. And I was a very active facilitator because I was trying to show you examples. So I probably did a little bit more than I normally would do. But let's say if you speak and then someone's responding to you, Ashley starts responding to that, right? What I would do is I would look back at you. And then Ashley, automatically, you want eye contact, right? I stopped looking at you, so then you would probably, and all of a sudden you're talking to each other, right? So just like a very little thing, but if I maintain eye contact, you're always looking at me, right? So you want to set it up, and we normally do that with the role of facilitator. Say, hey, now this is a conversation, so don't feel you have to talk to me, or you don't have to raise your hand. We want this a conversation between you, right, as we go. So even that modeling to attitude is complicated. So those first 5 are like basic facilitating responsibilities for all kinds of facilitation. Like as teachers, y'all all know this, right? Those are a lot of things you're doing. The last 5 are getting much more into the deliberative aspects of facilitation, right? The 6th does not take an expert role in the subject matter. We always tell our students that you're an expert on the process, but not on the content, right? We need to, and often in class, if it's a complicated issue, we might spend 2 or 3 days in class. They need to understand the acronyms. They need to understand the terms. They need to understand enough of the issue to be able to direct the issue. But at the same time, we don't want to be the experts in the issue. This is something truly that we're still struggling with to figure out. Maybe Wendy knows how to do this, but it's the hardest question when I'm training a facilitator to say, if someone has misinformation, they're saying something I know is wrong, right? What do you do? Right? I don't have a good answer to that right now. Right? Because if the facilitator says, actually, I think that statistic's wrong, right? I've now become an expert, not a facilitator, right? And I've also shut somebody down, right? But we also don't want that information to ruin the conversation, right? So we're always kind of, if the misinformation, if it's in the information, if it's in the book, we can just refer. Actually, if you look at page 3, that chart, that's safer. But if I'm just recalling, well, actually, I took an economics class and you're wrong. Now I'm a participant. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, and kind of along the same lines, if there's a piece of information that everyone involved is looking for, it's not a matter of misinformation, it's information they're trying to find that as a facilitator, are you in a position to contribute that? Because generally, unless something is black and white factually accurate, any information you give is going to have your biases built into it. So what you do in that situation.
Yeah, no, and I think it's about balancing these different things, right? So normally I would say you don't want to do that, right? Some of our events we have roving experts, right? So we'll have some experts in the room that the facilitator can call over. So for example, if it's a policy issue, right? If someone says, no, we passed a law last year, that thing's changed. No, I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed. You can call over an expert and say, what happened? Oh yeah, last year. So it clarifies it, right? Or I know like, when we did the school budget forms, we had the school finance officer in the room. Right, so we called him over, and he actually did a really good job. We coached him. I said, try to answer the factual question and get out of there as soon as possible, right? Because part of it, we want the expert to make the decision for us, right? If it's a tough decision, we'd rather the data be clear, right? In some issues, the data is clear, right? But most of the things that we deal with, the data is helpful, but doesn't make the answer. But you notice as soon as there's an expert, everyone's like, just tell us what to do. So he did a good job of exiting. We've had other experts to help him process that didn't do a good job, that took over, right? That told people this is what you need to be talking about, those type of things. But yeah, dealing with misinformation, I still don't have a good answer to that. I mean, typically it's, the downside of it is you change your role, right? So now you become the expert, so then your impartiality might be kind of questioned in there in some ways. So then it's harder to have the rest of the conversation. But if that one piece of misinformation really changes the conversation, sometimes it's worth it to say, you know what, to have a better conversation, we need to switch that away. There's other methods you can ask, if someone is saying the misinformation, you can just ask them, so does anyone have a different view? If there's a fact war, like one side has data, the other side has different data, you can sometimes play both sides. Well, let's assume now that this side's right? Well, why would that matter, right? And then after a while, flip. Okay, what if the other side's right? Sometimes you can just bracket it. It's interesting now with everyone with smartphones, right? So now if there's a factual issue, someone will start researching it, right? And trying to Google it and kind of find it in a way. Sometimes that actually can be useful, like with a change of law or those kind of things. But we're still trying to figure out the right ways of really, again, dealing with that balance between data mattering too much and data not mattering enough, right? A lot of my NIF friends are like, it's all about values. Like, just talk about values and facts are irrelevant. My background in argumentation is like, no, facts are important, right? So we need to struggle with that. We're trying to provide a base of facts here, but additional facts will kind of come in. And people will always inherently try to avoid the tough work of negotiating values by just trying to kind of make it about facts. So we're working on better ways of negotiating that. Health participants identify the values and underlying interests that motivate their perspectives. A lot of this goes back to conflict kind of management and moving from positions to interests and things like that, right? So people don't talk about values naturally. People base decisions based on values, but they're kind of implicit and kind of hidden. So part of the job of a deliberative facilitator is to think about those values and to help bring them out. And a lot of that is through paraphrasing, right? So when people say that they're really passionate about X, that getting up, okay, why? Why is that important to you, right? To kind of get down to, because typically, once we talk about values, we all kind of agree that the values are important, right? We might disagree on the positions, on the specific ideas that we want to do, but the reasons why are generally pretty broad, right? So that's the level of thinking that facilitators, and we normally prep our facilitators, we'll do a process, okay, what are the underlying values here that we care about, right? So then you're kind of going in thinking about these are the things that people are going to think are important. Right? Well, let's do that for a second. What are the values that we're kind of underlining that conversation about higher ed? What are some of the things that people care about? Going back to like the water slide, right? The 9 boxes. What are some of the boxes about higher ed?
Well, so I think the common value is that we value higher education as something in which we all participate and something that we share with the society.
So just higher education is value itself, kind of that broader thinking, kind of the whole person, the Renaissance kind of, that notion that that's when we're talking about a broad education and a global citizen, so we value that notion of people caring about lots of things and thinking about broader issues and the unexamined life and that kind of stuff, right? So that's one of them. What else? I mean, think about from the approaches. So approach one.
The utility?
Utility, okay, yeah, so competitive advantage, right? You know, approach one, which is interesting doing approach one with a global audience, right? Because it is that notion of like, the rest of the world's catching up, but there is that competitiveness, right? And a strong economy, right? So there's kind of value, and those are particular values in approach one, right? And approach two, you know, particular values of responsibility, kind of integrity and community, right? We're pretty important. Approach three is particularly kind of equality and compassion and fairness and justice, right? You know, so each one, you kind of look, I think you actually have this page. If you flip back to a page, this is page 51, I think. It kind of shows you the guts of an issue for them, right? So this one was on healthcare, but notice kind of the second to last row of values, you know, that's for each approach, those are some of the key values they're really focused on, right? And it's not that the other approaches are against those values, right? It's just each approach kind of focus, you know, has those values kind of higher up in a sense. So I spent a lot of time with my facilitators beforehand kind of thinking through, these are the kind of reasons, because we want to assume people are coming from a good place, right? So the first step is really getting a sense of all those kind of relevant values, and the next step goes to number 8. Helps participants, well, actually number 9, let's jump 8 for a second. Helps participants identify and work through the key tensions within and between their perspectives. So once you have all those values, then deliberation is, you know what, those values don't fit together very well, right? Like we like this well-rounded, you know, student that kind of thinks about all these different perspectives and knows multiple languages and it takes philosophy, right? But we also want higher ed to not be so expensive and then not have to spend so much time and then have job skills, right? And in some ways those are attention, in some ways it might not be attention, right? I know with our field, this is the thing that my opinion that I wanted to share, but I couldn't during the forum, is for we have communication studies major and then we have a journalism and technical communication major, right? Our major is much more liberal arts, right? You know, broad, and the Greeks and Aristotle, and you know, philosophy of communication, how we talk to each other. Their major is much more pre-professional. We're going to train you to be a PR person, or to be a journalist, or to write, you know. So people in their majors, I think, have a lot easier job finding a first job, right? Because they have this direct job skill that they can sell. Our students struggle with selling their major, right? I think 5-10 years afterwards, our students are in much better shape, right? Because our students have been taught how to think and how to, you know, have a much broader skill set, right? So I think 10 years in, our students are in much better shape. But you know, so in terms of that tension we talked about earlier, Jerome, with that notion of, you know, maybe these people skills, these other skills are job skills. They're just not as marketable as job skills. They're not as clear job skills, right? So that's kind of one way to think about that tension in a way, right? Yeah, so that approach number 9, and that's where I'm really kind of pushing a lot of our theory now, is how do we do that better, right? How do we really get people to kind of just explore these tensions? And we'll do that some with the polarity management. And you notice a couple of questions I asked, I specifically highlighted attention, right? To kind of react to that. I put that on the table. Sometimes those tensions come out naturally, with someone saying one side and the other side pushing. Sometimes the facilitator kind of, one side gets expressed and the facilitator kind of pushes on the other side, and then sometimes the facilitator puts them out themselves, right? But all those moves, again, are violating the pure impartiality, and violate both 1 and 2, because I'm not telling you, I'm not letting you talk about what you want to talk about, I'm saying you need to talk about the tension. Jumping back to 8, helps participants develop mutual understanding and consider a broad range of views, particularly the drawbacks of their perspectives and benefits of opposing views. A lot of this work is to get people to think more critically. Right? Our natural human impulse is to think of the advantages of our approach and the disadvantages of opposing approaches. That makes us feel very good about ourselves, right? So the purpose of the framing, the purpose of a conversation, the purpose of having a diverse audience, and the purpose of the facilitator is to get people to see the different sides, to play devil's advocate, right? So Thomas, right? Yeah. You know, play devil's advocate himself, right? Which is great, so I didn't have to do that, right? But if I had a group that everyone was thinking the same, I try to kind of show that with the second approach. The first 2 people really liked the second approach, right? So then my next question was, so far we've really liked this. What concerns do you have with this approach? You know, so I'm trying to kind of push on that to have some kind of balance, right? I'm trying to get it. Yeah. One specific thing we talk about this is whenever we play devil's advocate, again, we're violating impartiality, right? But you can play devil's advocate on different levels, right? So one level is for me to just kind of say, not put words in people's mouth, but just say, people that support this approach, what might they say, right? So I'm making y'all think about the other side, but I'm not, forcing people to, right? Then a little deeper level is I might pick someone who has that approach. If there was a business person here, right? What do you think they might say? So now I'm kind of invoking a voice. Sometimes if we do this process, we might actually put an empty chair in the middle of the room, right? We can't do this normally because we just do it at tables, right? But if we had an event like this, and we would say at the beginning, is like, at any point, you can put someone in the empty chair. Who's not here that should be here, right? It serves two purposes. One is people can actually do that, right? Say, I can imagine this person be here. It makes it easier to develop an advocate. But it also allows people to put their own opinion in the chair, but hide it, right? Say everyone in the group is very progressive, you're more conservative, you don't feel comfortable expressing your conservative viewpoint because everyone else is going to judge you, So you can say, well, I can imagine my friend if they were, but it's just a safe way to express your opinion, right? So that's another just process thing to help people kind of see different sides, right? Even further, I can say, instead of saying, if a business person was here, what they say, I might say, I imagine if a business person was here, they would say, yeah, these are all great ideas, but these taxes are going to make it hard for me to hire people. How would you respond to that, right? So now I'm not only invoking a voice, but I'm giving that voice and making an argument. Again, I'm not making the argument, I'm saying, if someone made that argument, how would you react to that, right? But again, now I'm putting a voice in. So each of those violates impartiality a little bit more, but each of them is a move to help people really think about the tensions and think about other sides and those type of things that might not be expressed, right? So they enjoy that. Then the last one's kind of all catch-all. Manage to settle a little bit of tensions. So find that balance between idealism and realism. One thing that came up a lot is this tension between kind of principles and implementation. Right? It's a kind of debate terms that we use. Right? There's a lot of ideas that people say we should do this. It makes so much sense, but then in reality, the implementation of it's hard. The example that really comes up, will probably come up this afternoon, is when we deal with childhood obesity issues like that, is health class, right? People always say, we need to teach kids about nutrition and that kind of stuff, because we have such bad nutrition, right? But can I ask college students, how many of y'all took a health class, every single one raised their hands, how many of those health classes were actually effective and useful? And it's probably like a 2%. Right, where they thought it was a good class. So the idea of a health class is a great idea. The implementation of it, not so much. I might even push on foreign languages. The idea of having people being bilingual, I completely support. The idea that you can learn a language in a college course, it's a little tougher, right? I mean, you need to immerse yourself in those type of things. The degree of just kind of having one of your classes being, it takes several years, right? It's much more useful to kind of immerse yourself and go to that, So there's those tensions in a sense between implementation, and that comes out. You pushed a little bit in terms of the political realities, right? So you supported the idea, but you're saying political realities are not going to let us do that, right? There's an interesting debate in my field of how much do we let political realities dictate the conversation, right? Some people will say this should be irrelevant. Let's just have a conversation, figure out the right thing to do, and then don't worry about if it's hard to do, right? And for some people, well, that's a useless conversation, right? If there's not going to be the money for it, or there's not going to be the political, will to do it, then why talk about it? As you imagine, I'm somewhere in the middle, right? Sometimes it's useful just kind of having the vision conversation regardless of constraints, and sometimes we have to take on the constraints, right? So that's a negotiation that the group is always going to kind of do in a sense, right? That we don't, you tend to have someone in your group that's just the negative Nancy, right? That just kind of poo-poos everything. That's not going to work, that's not going to work, that's not going to work. And that's a very unproductive conversation, right? So sometimes you have to say, well, let's not worry about political realities. Let's just talk about, and then maybe we come back around to those, right? Complexity versus simplicity, I already talked about that, right? We're trying to get things not so complex, but also not so simple, so we're going to negotiate in that middle. Depth versus breadth. We had several topics in the initial approach that I would have wanted to talk about, but if I talked about all of them, we would have spent a minute on each, right? So with your group, you're kind of deciding when do you, and that's a really specific decision for a facilitator. Do I ask another reaction question to dig deeper into that issue, or do I shift the conversation, right? And we'll talk about kind of practical things, right? So those are at least 10 things that, so facilitator is very much wearing multiple hats, and all of us are teachers, I think, almost all. So we're negotiating that already in lots of different senses. As you think about this, I usually do this to actually train my students and train community people that are doing these events. As professors, obviously, hopefully you can kind of strengthen your facilitation skills as you think through this. But then part of the question is, to what degree do we need to teach students these skills? just in our regular classes of having students facilitate. I mean, playing that facilitation role is such a kind of different kind of role for students that help them really think about issues. Students have lots of opportunities in their life, in their academic career, to be an advocate, right, to make an argument for something. But to switch them into this impartial role, or to switch them into a role that focusing on process, I think is a very useful kind of thing in a way. People seem very warm. Do we have any control of the AC? Or?
I can research that.
Okay. I tend to always be warm. I grew up in Houston, so I'm used to being warm and sweaty, but I've been in Colorado for 10 years, so. All right, so let's flip now to kind of real practical things. Page 57. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these broad deliberative processes that come into communities, they often will solicit volunteers to be facilitators, and then those volunteers will show up an hour early and they'll train volunteers in an hour to run the tables. Right? This is another tension I have with my field, because Kettering, they want to be able to do that, right? They want to kind of, they don't want to have such a high bar for a facilitator, because they know most people, there's few people that are willing to do that. I compare that to my experience the last 12 years of saying, it's hard to be a good facilitator. It's easy to learn the basics, but it's hard to get really good at it. Right?
But I think it's scary too. I think it's scary sometimes for the students.
Yeah.
Like when I was training, it's not the same, but training students in mediation, like just the skill building of it, they were like, it's intimidating.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of practice.
Yeah.
You can't just kind of read a book and then go do it in a sense. You have to do it and talk about it. And,
exactly.
Talk to other people about it and do all these kind of debriefs and so. So I'm developing, even just talking about those 10 responsibilities and negotiating tensions between them complicates it pretty significantly, right? And I know there's some people in my field, you can't make it that hard, right? Because if we professionalize this, then we're really closing it off, right? But really, the way I react to that is that's why every university needs a program like what you know, right?
Yeah.
I'm providing this capacity in my community that if every single college and university in the country, well, there's 7,000, I think, right, have this program, then the capacity of our community to have these conversations would elevate. And at the same time, students would be getting great skills, right?